July 3rd, 2026. The sand at Jones Beach is completely covered. 100,000 people are packed shoulder to shoulder for an upcoming airshow, all looking up to watch the sky. The heat is radiating off the sand. It's loud, festive, and almost every set of eyes is fixed upward, completely oblivious to the water directly behind them. But beneath the surface, a separate pattern was forming. In the days leading up to the holiday, the Long Island coast had recorded a quiet but steady string of shark sightings. This map tracks coastal predator sightings leading up to the holiday. A creeping cluster of activity moves directly towards Jones Beach. Then the holiday weekend arrives. A massive density of humans floods the exact waters where those predators gathered. When you have record-breaking crowds filtering into a concentrated zone of predator activity, the math narrows. A collision becomes highly probable. It only requires a trigger. That collision occurred right here at Field 6. Out in the vast sprawl of the state park, this specific stretch of water is where the holiday suddenly stopped. Amidst the swimmers, something struck. A swimmer felt a violent, localized impact to their right foot, pulled beneath the surface by a burst of energy. The unseen struggle was brief, but it left clear physical evidence. The swimmer sustained a deep, distinctly tooth-shaped laceration across the foot. That specific wound geometry rules out his scrape on a rock or a cut from broken glass. The puncture pattern confirmed it was the bite of an apex predator. Within seconds, the realization of what had just happened spread from the immediate swimmers out to the dry shoreline. A single strike shattered the illusion of the beach as a pristine, controlled swimming pool. In an instant, the water reverted to a wild marine habitat. The emergency response was immediate. The shoreline defense sprang into action, pulling the bleeding victim out of the surf and onto the sand. Paramedics rapidly transported the swimmer off the beach and to a local hospital, successfully separating them from the danger zone to receive care. Back at the Central Mall, word of mouth spread through the massive crowd. Rumors and breaking news alerts began pinging across thousands of phones, generating immediate confusion. Authorities executed a sweeping mandate. They ordered a total lockdown of the beach, banned anyone from entering the surf, and launched an intensive search protocol. But the search revealed a stark irony. Despite deploying boats, drones, and hundreds of human spotters, a full hour ticked by with zero signs of the animal. The shark had completely vanished into the deep ocean. The massive, fruitless search proved a simple reality. Human authority, with all its organization and resources, stops exactly at the water's edge. Look at the beach now. 100,000 people are sitting on dry land, staring at an ocean they are strictly barred from entering. The paradox here is that this risk is actually the result of an environmental success. Decades of conservation efforts have cleaned up these coastal waters, bringing bait fish and the predators that hunt them back to life. We now have two distinct trends moving in parallel: a healthy predator population returning to the water, and an ever-growing density of humans flocking to the coasts every summer. It leaves us with a difficult choice. Do we treat encounters like this as isolated tragedies that we can simply manage away with more drones and tighter lifeguard patrols? Or, as the ocean continues to heal and our shorelines pack tightly with people, is sharing the water with apex predators the unavoidable cost of swimming in a living sea?
Hey everyone, welcome to this Explainer Masterclass. So, if you're a B2 to C1 English learner and you've just watched that absolutely gripping story of the shark incident at Jones Beach, well, you are in exactly the right place. Today, we're not just going to sit here and retell that story. No, we're going to dig in and analyze exactly how the narrator built such incredible tension using advanced English vocabulary. By deconstructing this narrative together, you're going to learn the idioms, the collocations, and those connective phrases that will make you sound highly fluent and sophisticated in your own English communication. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. We've broken our narrative deconstruction into 4 distinct blocks to make it easy. First up, block 1, setting the scene. Then, block 2, building tension. After that, block 3, the turn. And finally, block 4, register and signposts.
So block 1, setting the scene. You know, every truly great story starts by establishing the environment and the characters' blind spots. And that's exactly what we're looking at first.
Now, what's really interesting about this first part is how the narrator creates this intense feeling of vulnerability before anything even happens, just by using highly visual descriptive vocabulary. Take a look at our first expression, packed shoulder to shoulder. The exact quote from the story is, 100,000 people are packed shoulder to shoulder for an upcoming air show. In a spoken descriptive register, this just literally means extremely crowded, with people standing so close that their bodies are actually touching. So a fresh example for your vocabulary bank could be, during the rush hour commute, the subway car was packed shoulder to shoulder. All right, our second phrase is oblivious to. The story notes the crowd was completely oblivious to the water directly behind them. This is a slightly more formal, descriptive phrase, and it means entirely unaware of something, usually something pretty important. For example, you could say, she read her book on the park bench, totally oblivious to the loud construction noise across the street. Notice how these two phrases work together to paint a picture? Crowded, yet completely unaware. Next, the narrator establishes this creeping sense of inevitability, using linked time phrases in a neutral narrative register. The story says, in the days leading up to the holiday, the Long Island coast had recorded a quiet but steady string of shark sightings. That first part, in the days leading up to, is a fantastic connective phrase. It simply means the period immediately before an event. Like in the days leading up to the product launch, the marketing team worked around the clock. And then we have a string of sightings, which refers to a series of similar events happening one right after another. For example, the neighborhood experienced a string of burglaries over the summer. By linking these phrases, the narrator is basically telling us, hey, the danger wasn't sudden at all. It was building up all along.
All right, moving right along. Block 2, building tension. This is where the author really starts to raise the stakes, using precise, analytical vocabulary.
So the scene is set. Now watch how the author raises the tension. They don't do it by throwing in overly emotional words. Instead, they shift to this precise, almost clinical vocabulary. Read this exact sentence from the story with me. When you have record-breaking crowds filtering into a concentrated zone of predator activity, the math narrows. It's a brilliant shift in tone, isn't it? The narrator goes straight from describing a sunny beach to analyzing a deadly equation. Let's look a bit closer at that specific phrase, the math narrows. Now, this is an analytical metaphor, and it's often used in formal spoken English. It basically means the probability of an event happening becomes increasingly certain as the variables decrease. It sounds cold, calculated, and just totally inevitable. If you wanted to use this in a business context, for instance, you could say, as the deadline approached with no new funding, the math narrowed for the startup. So the crucial point here is that a collision is now practically inevitable. The narrator follows up with, it only requires a trigger. This is a neutral descriptive phrase meaning to need a final specific event to set a much larger reaction into motion. Kind of like a loaded spring, right? A fresh example for your notes could be, the unstable snowpack on the mountain only required a trigger to start an avalanche. Let's see how this builds into an escalation of technical register as the story finally confirms the shark bite. The narrator says that specific wound geometry rules out a scrape on a rock. The puncture pattern confirmed it was the bite of an apex predator. Let's break that down into 3 steps. Step 1. To rule out. This means to eliminate a possibility. It's formal spoken or written English. For example, the doctor ran a blood test to rule out an infection. Step 2 is wound geometry. Now this is highly technical register, meaning the physical shape and dimensions of an injury. You might hear the forensic expert analyze the wound geometry to determine the type of tool used. And step 3, an apex predator. This is also technical and scientific, referring to an animal at the very top of the food chain with absolutely no natural predators. Like, as an apex predator, the polar bear plays a crucial role in maintaining the Arctic ecosystem. By using this clinical, scientific vocabulary, it actually makes the shark attack feel so much more serious and terrifying.
Okay, on to block 3, the turn. This is exactly where the narrative shifts from observation to sudden dramatic action. The tension finally breaks and the chaos begins. To express this sudden shift, the narrator uses dramatic transition phrases in a formal narrative register. The story states, a single strike shattered the illusion of the beach. The water reverted to a wild marine habitat. First up, to shatter the illusion. This means to violently and suddenly destroy a false belief or a deceptive appearance. A great fresh example is, the sudden bankruptcy shattered the illusion that the company was financially stable. Then we have to revert to, which means to return to a previous, often wilder or less developed state. You could say, without regular maintenance, the beautiful garden quickly reverted to a patch of weeds. Basically,
The beach is no longer a swimming pool. Nature has completely taken it back.
As the emergency response kicks in, the vocabulary shifts into what we call a news register. You know, those phrases you'll often hear journalists use on TV. First, the shoreline defense sprang into action. To spring into action means to suddenly and vigorously begin moving or working. Like when the fire alarm sounded, the emergency response team sprang into action. Next, the narrator says, authorities executed a sweeping mandate. Now, a sweeping mandate is a broad, powerful official order that affects a whole lot of people. For instance, the new government issued a sweeping mandate to reduce carbon emissions across all industries. And finally, but the search revealed a stark irony. A stark irony refers to a very clear, often pretty harsh, contrast between what is expected and what actually happens. Example, it was a stark irony that the marriage counselor was going through a bitter divorce. These three phrases are just incredibly useful for summarizing dynamic events in your own advanced English output.
Which brings us to block 4, register and signposts. Let's shift our focus to how you can take these final figurative expressions and use them in your own essays and interviews.
The narrator actually brings this whole story to a close with this incredibly powerful sentence. The massive, fruitless search proved a simple reality. Human authority, with all its organization and resources, stops exactly at the water's edge. I mean, wow, this is an absolute masterclass in using a figurative closer to finalize a formal argument.
And this brilliantly illustrates our next idiom for you, to stop at the water's edge. Now, in a formal written register, this doesn't literally mean the physical beach. It means the absolute limit of one's power, influence, or jurisdiction. It's that boundary where your control just completely ends. If you're writing a business essay, you might write something like, the CEO's influence over her employees' personal lives stops at the water's edge of the office door. It is just a highly sophisticated way to describe a firm boundary. Let's look at one last comparison to really show you how register changes everything. In casual speech, if you're accepting a negative consequence, you'd probably just say, well, that's just something you have to deal with. But in a formal essay or an interview, you would want to use the narrator's phrase, the unavoidable cost of. The story asks if the danger is the unavoidable cost of swimming in a living sea. A fresh example for an academic essay could be, many economists argue that mild inflation is the unavoidable cost of a rapidly growing economy. See how that works? It instantly elevates your English from conversational straight up to professional.
Which brings us right back to that final provocative question posed by the narrator. Is sharing the water with apex predators the unavoidable cost of swimming in a living sea? It's definitely a fascinating environmental dilemma, but honestly, more importantly for us today, it is a perfect example of how advanced, precise vocabulary can make an argument truly resonate. I highly encourage you to take these phrases, everything from the math narrows to a stark irony, and try applying them in your very next English writing task. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep practicing those high-level registers.